Welcome to the Eat, Play, Love Holiday Edition. I'm Sandra Elia, Director of Education and Patient Advocacy at Obesity Matters. Meet my co-host, Rachel Atkins.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Atkins, Director of Strategy with Obesity Matters.
Obesity Matters is a nonprofit organization for people living with elevated weight. And sorry, I just lost my screen for a moment. This happens each time. With elevated weight and obesity, it was formed by patient advocates whose focus is to provide evidence-based education and advocate for public policy and environmental changes that enable well-being. And if we can do that, we are one step closer to acceptance and inclusion of millions of people in larger bodies. The Eat, Play, Love Holiday Series runs weekly interactive events with experts and patient advocates. The first half of the episode is an interview, and then we turn the spotlight on you, the audience, to address your questions and comments in a safe and supportive environment. This season, we're focused on reframing how you celebrate the holidays. Holidays tend to have highs and they tend to have lows. They have wonderful and joyous times, and they have their challenges, whether it's being faced with a bunch of triggering food or faced with a bunch of triggering relatives. We're here to give you some strategies and ways for you to have the healthiest, happiest holidays you can. We're also adding a holiday theme to each episode. And for today, we'd like you to hold up your favorite mug. So I've got since we have no place to go, let it snow, let it snow. So let's see. Oh, wonderful. Nice mug, Rosie. Very nice, Sandra. Oh, I love that. So great. Thank you. Today, our special guests are Dr. Sasha High, an obesity medicine specialist, and a patient advocate, Tanya Bender. Sasha and Tanya, we are thrilled to have you here with us today. Before we start diving into questions, please introduce yourselves. Sasha, we'll start with you. I understand you're an internalist. Why did you choose to specialize in obesity medicine?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sandra and Rachel. Thanks so much for having me here. This is an honor to be with all of you. I have been practicing obesity medicine since 2012, and really my interest in it was that I was always interested in both preventative healthcare and overall wellness. And obesity is a disease, but it's also a risk factor. And so I think the really fun thing about treating obesity is that when we address obesity and we empower people with effective evidence-based treatment, we also improve so many other health outcomes. And it's such a new field too, which is another reason I love it. I really think it's only evolved and become more mainstream in the last decade, which is when I've been practicing in it. And as we've learned more about adiposity and the neurobiology and the psychology of eating, we have much more effective support, much more effective treatment for patients now. And I think it's a really exciting field because it is continuing to evolve, and we're continuing to do better for patients. And I just love empowering people to live their healthiest lives.
You're so right, Sasha. We are in an exciting time. Science is really beginning to understand obesity in a new way, and also to be able to treat it in a powerful way. So over to you, Tanya. What brings that? Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here today.
Well, I'm here today. A bit about myself is I don't know really where to start with that, but I am going through life changes. Actually, this year I think almost 15 months now, has been a lot of change for me. It started with weight management, but it's then taken on a whole other role. Career-wise, relationship-wise, you name it, it's been quite the transformation. What has led me here today is my work with Dr. Sasha High, which has opened up the opportunity to speak to you guys here today about my journey a little bit. And what brought me to Sasha was obviously struggles with my weight for over 30 years, up and down. I sort of frame it as that habitual rabbit or hamster wheel, not rabbit, but hamster wheel, which doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result and never really getting that different result. So 30 plus years later, I am in a very different position, and I'm happy to share that with you today, some of the learnings that have come from that.
That's fascinating. Tanya, your journey really is a very interesting story, and thank you for touching on it there. Would you mind sharing a little bit more detail with us? And perhaps even you can touch on that aha moment that many of us has, through this journey with weight management.
Sure. I've had a couple, I would say maybe 3. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. We had to mute someone.
Okay. I've had a few aha moments through this journey I've been on. What led me to Sasha, though, was quickly, my stepfather had an issue medically that the surgeon dealing with him referred him to Sasha because he struggled with his weight all his life. And with that, it opened it up to my mother, who also has struggled with weight issues, and then opened it up to me. But I tried to sort of emulate what they were doing with Sasha, and I quickly realized that all of our journeys are very, very similar when it comes to obesity, but very different. And I needed to own that part myself. So I sort of branched off from that and contacted the clinic and started working with their team there. So that's sort of what sparked it off, but really quickly that also, I was like at a rock bottom. I thought my only option now that was left was gastric bypass. I thought that's where I need to go. Although for years I struggled with that decision, not to say that isn't a method that can be used and should be used for people, but innately in myself, I always knew that's not something I really wanted to do because I also believed I had an issue mentally, that if I didn't address the problems or the challenges in my brain, that I could go through this gastric bypass, but 5 years from now, I would be back in the same position. But I didn't know how to facilitate that. I knew it, and I tried my best, but I never seemed to get there. So once I started hearing through my mom and my stepfather, the messages that they were getting and the learning and education they were having with the clinic, I was like, okay, you know what? That's what I've been thinking about. So I need someone to help me navigate that. So thankfully for me, I didn't need gastric bypass. I was able to identify triggers were a huge aha moment to me, not realizing that my lack of control or my urges or cravings were being brought on by the foods that I was eating. I didn't understand that connection. Another one would be moderation, talking about that. And I don't know how far you want to get into that, but moderation was a big one, that not everybody can do certain types of food necessarily in moderation, and that's okay. And another really big one was, I used to believe that everybody else dealt with food the way I did. So everybody had the urges and the cravings and the brain banter of that devil and angel, one on each shoulder, saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Oh, just this one time, it's just one that, and then you constantly have this brain banter happening. I figured everybody else had that same thing, but I was the only one, or I, with other people who manage their weight, I was the only one that couldn't control it. So then that brought on feelings of shame and disappointment and anger in yourself. And so once I realized that, wait a minute, other people can overindulge, enjoy that indulgence and move on with none of those other things, no urges, cravings, brain banter. I'm different. And okay, let's tackle that. Where are we going to work with that? And that started to chip away at the shame, the blame, you name it, all those negative connotations that you're using towards yourself. I was able to separate myself from that. I don't know what it feels like to overindulge and it not become a slippery slope or a rabbit hole. I just don't.
You bring up such an important point, and I really like the way that you framed it, that there are certain foods for you, trigger foods, that you have enough experience with that ignite more cravings, that ignites the hunt for more, more, more. And so you approached it from that way. And I know that Dr. High often speaks about the difference between restriction and restraint. And so restriction is never a good idea. And I hope everybody on this call knows that, and knows that restriction will often lead to binging and then cycle round and round we go. Now, with the word restraint, for me, always brought up bad feelings. It was definitely a word that was used to shame me. Like, why can't you restrict yourself, Sandra? Why can't you restrict the food that you take in? Now, I have a very open mind to hearing how Dr. High frames this, because I am a huge fan of her work and I admire her ability to treat obesity in an empathetic way and using science. But I worry that our audience has a negative connotation with restraint, right? We restrain dangerous people, we restrain situations that are out of control. So I'm gonna throw that question over to you, Dr. High.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, you know, for me, the way I explain restriction versus restraint. So restriction is this idea that I can't have something. I'm on a diet and therefore I can't eat that food and that food. And so you're sitting at Christmas dinner, looking at all the foods you can't have because you're doing this diet, and that just feels terrible. And the whole time you're begrudging the experience, you're hating it, you're sitting there thinking about the foods you can't have and how deprived you are. And it just generates so much negative emotion. And you might be able to, like, you know, white knuckle yourself through that maybe for one meal, but you can't sustain that. You can't continue living that way. That's what dieting feels like. It feels like you're being punished, that because you have to diet, you can't have these things that you really want. So the whole experience is just negative, right? And human beings can't persist in that negative state long term. Like, you don't choose to put yourself through that long term. So it's not sustainable. So instead, we offer this idea, we teach our clients this idea that you are an adult. You can eat anything you want. No one can tell you what to do, because that's the ownership that you have. So if you are in a place where you love yourself and you want to take care of yourself in the best way possible, what do you want to choose, right? And there are times where you're going to choose to have the pie with Christmas dinner because it's worth it. It's like your grandmother's pie, and it's like that time is in line with your values, and that's worth it to choose that. And there's going to be other times where, you know what, your health goals outweigh the value of that dessert. And so you're going to choose in a really loving, kind, self-compassionate way to refrain from having that, to practice that restraint, that, you know what, it's not worth it for me to do that today. And the experience is very different. It's very empowering when you know that the choice is on you. You're not being told what to do. You know, you don't have, like, as soon as you feel like you're being told what to do, you rebel, right? Like, no one likes being told what to do. So instead, it's this idea that you get to choose. And so from that place where you're in control, what do you want to choose in a really kind way instead of being punished?
I want to hear Tanya's take on this. What do these words mean to you? And what was the hardest part of learning restraint, and how it helped you in adopting healthier habits?
Well, so to be honest, when I first heard these words, I was like, they're the exact same. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, restraint and restriction, they're two R's, very similar words. And to me, they had similar meaning. It wasn't something I was able to hear and run with. It absolutely wasn't. I had to wrap my head around it a little bit. And through doing the work, what I was able to realize is I did connect with restriction being a negative and restraint being a positive. Restriction is I can't, and restraint is something I am choosing. And one of the things that happened with both of those is that I also realized that I never learned restraint in my formative years. So if you look at restriction and restraint as being almost the same, like I did at the beginning, what you'll find is that in everything you do in your life, when have you ever restrained yourself? We restrict ourselves, as Sasha said, in diet. A lot of times they go hand in hand. I can't have that. I very much use this one terminology of I can never have that ever again. And that wasn't getting me anywhere really quickly. And we were able to break that down and work through it. And I don't say that anymore. But when you talk about restraint, the pantry doors as a child, even growing up, were never closed to me. And that's a thing that you would learn as you grow up, is restraining yourself from certain things. So I don't see restraint as a negative in any way. I look at it and I change those words to can't and choose. And I choose to do something versus saying I can't do something. And what are the reasons why I'm choosing that? They have been transformative to me, because the inner dialogue that has to happen now when I think about those words, I never talked to 15 months ago, 2 years ago, I never talked to myself the way I talk to myself now. And one of those is talking in myself about can't and choose. Nobody's stopping me from going to the grocery store right now and buying a pint of ice cream. Nobody's stopping me from eating 3 chocolate bars. I can go and do that if I want to. If I choose to, I could do that. If I choose not to do that, why am I choosing that? What are my values? What are the things that I want in my life? And making a decision. So it has taken time to use restraint and to learn it and practice it. My go-to is not restraint. It is a restriction, which makes me want to do other things. But, you know, Sandra, to tie that in, restriction and restraint go hand in hand with my triggers. So everything is a puzzle piece that's fitting together to create this big journey of a puzzle for me. And so we can talk about these, we can compartmentalize these little things that add up to a big picture, but they all sort of interconnect to make sense in the story and the journey you're going on.
That makes so much sense. I really love how you're using that language to really empower yourself. And I think, you know, for a lot of us with the upcoming holidays, there's a lot of concern around, you know, maybe we can use that language to help us get through what could, for some of us, feel a little bit, we could feel a little bit fearful about. And, you know, I guess this next question is for you, Sasha. You know, for a lot of us that are living in larger bodies, we look at the holidays and we think it's going to be a time of overindulgence, and then that's going to be followed by that guilt and that shame. Do you have any tools and techniques that we can use to reframe those thoughts? So maybe we could think about the holidays more in a joyful way, where we're actually anticipating that time that we get together with family and friends, and there will be lots of great treats and food there.
Yeah. And Rachel, I think it's so important that we're talking about reframing our thoughts, because what we do a lot of work around is our psychology and empowering our mindset, because your external actions will always stem from your internal environment. So what typically happens with any form of like dieting is you try to change your actions. You try to like not eat certain things. You try to follow rules, but you have these underlying beliefs that are actually going to just come out and produce your actions. So I'll give you an example. If you have like these subconscious thoughts, like, I never get Christmas cookies, and Christmas cookies only come at this one time of year, and it's so special. And like, it's very subconscious messaging that's going on behind the scenes. But what's happening with that kind of thinking is it's building lots of desire. So you're producing all this over desire. And the idea that it's only available at this one time of year also produces scarcity, which is really rooted in fear. And this, like, you're going to have this sense of like urgency, right? So what happens as a result of that? Because all of our actions, as I said, stem from that internal thought process and our feelings. So if you're feeling scarcity, fear, and urgency, that is a recipe for overeating, right? Because you're going to just eat all the cookies because it's like this thing that you may not get again for 12 months, right? And so rather than just trying to set rules for yourself around the cookies, which may work for a short amount of time, but if you're still believing that, you're going to act out on that. We look at, well, what are you believing and how can we reframe that thought? So, you know, if we can break it down and get to those underlying belief systems and be able to say, you know what, actually, you could bake Christmas cookies every weekend if you wanted to. You could bake Christmas cookies in June and July and just kind of break down and be like, is that thought really serving you? Like, do you want to go into the holidays feeling fearful and feeling scarcity, which is going to lead to overindulgence? Or do you want to go in feeling like peaceful to be able to make the decisions that you want to be making, right? And then you can go into it and just decide like which cookies are worth it for me to eat and how many do I want to have today from a place of like this peaceful emotion. So another like example that I think comes up a lot is this sense of like, well, everyone is overeating, so it's justified, right? So I can too, like everyone's doing it. And as human beings, we want to fit into the tribe. We don't want to be the odd man out, like the person who's, who's missing out on anything. So we want to fit in. And if you look at that thought, that's probably going to lead to overeating. And you might be right. That might be true. Everyone might be overeating, and you could totally justify that thought if you want to, but you can ask yourself, like, when you're believing that, does that serve you? Does it serve you to believe that? Does that align with your values? Does that cause you to take action according to who you want to be? Or is that a thought that you want to challenge, right? And so when we start kind of reframing our beliefs, and it becomes less about setting rules for yourself, which is dieting, right? Dieting and setting rules like, I can only have, one piece of dessert, or I have to fill my plate with this. That can be helpful, but what that teaches you is you can live in a box. You can live in this box of rules, and as long as you're inside that box, everything's going to go okay. But the problem is life happens outside of that box, right? And you don't find yourself, fitting this perfect box all the time, and then you don't know what to do with yourself because you haven't figured out how to handle life outside the box. So instead, it's so powerful to be able to do that deeper work, that thought, we call it thought work, and evaluate those underlying beliefs and decide if you want to. You can get to change your beliefs at any time, which is fun too, right? You get to decide how you want to think going into the holidays. How do you want to feel going into the holidays? Do you want to feel, as you said, Rachel, joyful and at peace and like you're in control, and that you get to make the decisions of how this is going to go? That's amazing. So that's kind of the mindset going into it. I do want to address that shame and guilt that happens afterwards, right? Just drop it. Just drop all the shame and guilt. It's not productive and it's not helpful. We tend to think that if we talk about, I'm so disappointed with myself and I'm such a terrible person, like I did it again, I knew I didn't have control, and we go into this like beating ourselves up thing, and we tend to think it's productive somehow. It is not productive. It does not lead us to take better action. It completely disempowers us. It completely discourages us. So, just, be aware if your brain goes there, your brain is in a pathological way trying to help you to take better action, except it just doesn't work. It's like a very opposite of what's going to work. Instead, to be able to just objectively evaluate and say, okay, you know what, I'm really not loving the consequences of my actions yesterday. So how can I take it from here? What do I want to shift so that I can take actions that serve me today, right? So it's not denying that maybe you had an overindulgence that you're not super happy with, but it's not beating yourself up. It's being compassionate and being like, yeah, I'm a human being. These foods are made to be overeaten. So, I ate a little bit more than I had planned to. So how can I set myself up for success today, right? How can I take care of myself in the best way possible today?
Yeah, I love that, kind of training yourself to think in a different way, because you're right. Like our actions are actually driven by, the moods that we're in, the thoughts that we have, and that's really what turns out to be how we act on something. So, I guess the other thing is that sometimes retraining how we think about things, that can be difficult, and we need support. And certainly in the area of retraining the way you think about things, you might want to approach something like cognitive behavioral therapy. And that means, being in touch with healthcare providers that can help with that, or maybe there's other things as well. So actually, this question is for both of you. Do you have some advice on how we could advocate for ourselves within the healthcare profession? So that's for Tanya or Sasha.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think to think about that question, I think you need, and I can only really approach it from my point of view, right? So in my point of view, if I could talk to myself 15 months ago, I would say to myself that when you're dealing with your healthcare provider, your regular GP, to actually really own your obesity. And to maybe do some work, if I had known to do some work in educating myself about obesity, that maybe I could lead my GP down a different track. I had said in my journey story that I used to avoid the doctor, because I knew the last time I was at the doctor when things were elevated, that I was supposed to work on my weight. Now I didn't, or I did, and then I ended up gaining more and plus a bit more. Now I don't want to face that. I don't want to face what I already know. And what are we going to say? Okay, next time it just was awful. I would just avoid it. That's not the answer. I don't know if I had owned my obesity, or if even I was asked the right question. So I realized that I was never asked the right question in my doctor's office. I was never asked the question of, do you binge eat? And if I was asked that question, I don't think I was given an explanation of what binge eating was. I would relate binge eating to more, it happens every day, or binge eating and maybe purging. So that was something very different than what I was going through. So I didn't realize binging could just be a session of overeating. I didn't know that it could happen maybe a few times a month, or maybe a couple times a week. I figured if it wasn't every day, I wasn't a binge eater. So, that was life-changing to me, to realize I have a problem with that. What I can do in that area. And that allows someone like Sasha, who's a doctor, to be able to treat me in two different ways, to look at me both on a mental perspective, but also physiology, what's going on in my body and my brain, and how are they connecting, and how can we tackle that? So if you can open up that dialogue with your GP, if your GP is not doing that with you already and asking you questions, maybe you should ask them questions ask them to give you more information on. You own that. And Sasha, you can jump in here, but I'm not sure how much training a GP gets in obesity. And if they're not specialized in that, they don't really maybe have all the knowledge that they have to help you where you need to go. So I think that's where I would start, is just being honest about how food affects you. How does it affect your mind? What are those urges like, or cravings? How do you feel about yourself? That's what your GP is there for. And just taking that time, and then maybe by you owning your obesity and you being honest with them, will open up a different path and different programs and different things out there that can support you in your journey.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think, I think Tanya's right in that so many family doctors don't know what is effective treatment for obesity. And they're certainly not trained in, doing the psychology of eating and the CBT for binge behaviors and all that. Like that's complex stuff, right? And we can't knock our family doctors for that, but that's just not what they're trained to do. I believe that effective obesity treatment happens in a specialized clinic, because I think it is a really complex field. But it's also a medical system issue, right? Like there's no obesity medicine training in medical school or residency for anyone. So anyone who's now an obesity specialist has learned that after the fact because of their own interest. So that's a whole other story. So I think that doing things like this, where we need to empower patients to advocate for themselves, because you may very well go to your family doctor and they don't know how to bring up the conversation. There's data on this, right? Like they feel awkward about bringing up the conversation, you feel awkward, so it just doesn't happen, or they do it in a shaming, judging way, and then you don't want to talk to them. So I think learning to be able to advocate for yourself and know that there is effective treatment available. And so don't just settle for, well, why don't you just count your calories for a bit? Have you tried eating less, right? Like if you get that story, that's not okay. It's not enough. And so you can use the Obesity Canada clinic locator. You can go online and do your own research and find specialized clinics that have multidisciplinary support. I believe there needs to be a mindset or psychotherapy, like mindset coaching or psychotherapy component to it, particularly if you are someone who has compulsive eating behaviors, binge eating, stress eating, any of that stuff, and you need help with that. But it's out there. Right. And so as long as we help patients to advocate for themselves, and, I do a lot of continuing medical education for family doctors and specialists, we are doing that. And there is, I know all of my colleagues across the country, we're all doing a lot of education to improve the system, but we need to be improving it on both sides, on the patient side, as well as on the healthcare provider side.
Thank you. If I could just add a summary to that, I do believe that obesity is a specialized field. And so understanding that across Canada, not everyone's going to have access to doctors like Dr. High. So there is also My Weight What to Know clinic locator. So you can go on there and try to find a specialist in your area. that may not be possible if you're in a more rural area. And so the other thing is just to, when you do speak to your GP, to listen for certain things. So if your GP says you should lose some weight and offers no treatment, there's 3 pillars of treatment, whether that's CBT or behavioral change, anti-obesity drugs or bariatric surgery, that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to say just lose weight, or if they offer you something as it's as simple as calories in and calories out, you just need to move a little more and eat a little less, that's also not acceptable. And you know that you need to look for other help. I always worry that, you know, somebody who's experienced bias and been stigmatized about their weight, it's very hard to put the onus on them to be able to then go to the person that inflicted that behavior on them and then advocate for themselves. Like it doesn't always sound that fair to me. And so if that's your position, then it may be time to find a new person or new healthcare provider to talk about obesity with. So our final question that we ask everybody from Obesity Matters, still a very young organization. Do you have any guidance, Dr. High, on how we can support our community? And then I'll go over to Tanya.
I mean, I think conversations like this are perfect, right? Conversations like this. I'm so impressed with the turnout. Amazing, yeah. Over 100 people on this Zoom call. So fun. But yeah, having conversations and understanding that we've come such a long way in the treatment of obesity. As I said, it's really been the last decade, right? Before this, we did not have good treatment. And so the more we can have conversations, the more we can empower people to understand. Just because you've done 100 diets and quote unquote failed those diets, like you didn't fail them, they failed you, right? So you just need 100%. To get the right treatment for what you're dealing with. These conversations I think are perfect.
And Tanya, any advice for us as we serve our community?
No, I think Dr. High just framed it up perfectly. It's having a community like this. It's people sharing their stories and you being able to connect with people to know that you're not alone, that you're not the only one that has particular challenges when it comes to your weight and food. But knowing that there is help out there and us as a community working together to get that in.
Oh, I think Tanya's frozen, at least for me. So you know what, I'll take this opportunity to open the floor now. The floor is now open for audience questions. We will alternate between live questions and the ones in the chat box in order of relevance. We encourage you to turn on your camera when you're ready to ask your question, introduce yourself and let us know where you're tuning in from. Please raise your hand virtually using the Zoom feature. So we have our first question out of the gate, Michael. Hello, Michael. Michael, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I just did. Yeah.
Wonderful. Good to see you. Where are you calling in from?
Good to see you. I'm calling, I am in Vancouver, Canada, of course. So happy to be here and learn a couple of new things. I'm running a technology company called Mind Therapeutics. And the question I have is for Dr. Sasha High. So Sasha, you're focusing, I heard, more on prevention and wellness. And so the question I have for you is, what is the advice that you actually typically give to a patient who obviously has obesity? That's number one. And the second question, if I may, is what would be your advice to, the ecosystem, the technology ecosystem in Canada, on how we can help specialists like you in Canada to actually improve the access to knowledge and expertise, because I believe there's only about 70 or 100 of you in the country, and we have 7 million plus Canadians with obesity. So there's no way, I believe, for you to actually be able to serve that kind of a population without the help from technology. So 2 questions. Thank you.
Hi, Michael. Nice to see you. So to answer your first question, I can't summarize our entire 2-year program in one sentence, but if I were to kind of give you the big picture, like we work on you get to love yourself exactly as you are, fully accepting yourself. And if you want to lose weight from there, let's empower you with the tools to do that. And that involves a lot of thought work. That involves sometimes medical treatment. It involves a whole constellation of things. So, that's how we would address people with obesity. To answer your second question, not a leading question at all, but I know that you're involved with the technology side, and I think that it's a really important area. I will say for our clinic, the use of technology, especially over the last 2 years, has, and I think Denise is one of our patients. Hi, Denise. Mentioned this. We are now serving 3 provinces, so that's really amazing, right? Whereas 2 years ago, I was seeing patients in the GTA, and maybe, if they were willing to drive 2 hours, we could see them. Now we see patients in Northern Ontario, in rural Newfoundland, in Nova Scotia, and technology allows us to do that. And having, I think there's really creative ways, especially I know what you're working on with the app, but there's really creative ways to deliver healthcare that are different from our current medical model. So we have an online platform that we use where people can access things on an app as well, where they can get our podcast and our video content and their worksheets, and we have group interactions over Zoom, where people can get community support without having to go and sit in a clinic somewhere in person. So I think technology is opening that up, and I know that there are exciting things coming from your company as well in the future. So that would be my answer, that yes, we need to leverage technology and new ways, and even social media, right? So people can listen to my podcast and get free advice now, and that can go all over the world. Like, that's amazing. People can go on Instagram and find experts. You have to be careful, right? With social media, you need to find the right people, but we can leverage these different channels.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to check in with the chat box. Rosie, any questions there?
Great, thank you, Sandra. Yes, we have a question on the topic of bariatric surgery. We have a specific question that says, can a person be successful losing weight without bariatric surgery? So I guess the overall question is, what is the role of bariatric surgery when it comes to weight loss?
Yeah, I guess I'll tackle that one. Bariatric surgery is one of the 3 pillars according to the guidelines. It is a tool. It is a tool that for some people is the right avenue. And, there are official criteria based on, what your BMI is and what other conditions you might have that can make you qualify for bariatric surgery. And for some people, it's a great tool. For other people, though, there may not be access, number one, or like what this person said, that it might be risky. There are other very effective interventions, but we need to be seeking the right interventions. So when we start believing that it's finding the right diet, we're just chasing down the wrong avenue, right? So we need to be seeking out an expert who can kind of guide you in that, whether that includes psychotherapy to do some of that. Maybe there's some inner healing work that needs to be done, or some thought reframing that needs to be done, or whether it's getting the appropriate medications. And I sort of alluded to this earlier, but we're in an era now with, we have currently 3 approved medications, another one coming in January, and in the next decade, there's a whole lot of new medical treatments that will be coming out that tackle the brain, which we know that this is a disease of neurobiology, and that we're expecting to have very effective response to. So there is effective treatment out there. It's a matter of finding a specialist who can help support you and guide you through that decision of what's going to be in your toolbox. Sandra, you're muted.
Thank you. Back to the chat box for another question, please.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sandra. We're getting a few questions that have a similar theme around coverage for treatments and for services related to obesity. Do you have advice in terms of how patients can find access for these treatments and services when they're not covered by all governments and private insurance plans?
Sorry, I'm trying to read it at the same time. So that is, I will not deny it, that is one of the challenges that we have today, is that, as I said earlier, obesity is a disease and a risk factor. So it is disease treatment, which is funded by the government, right, typically, but it's also disease prevention. And so the preventative piece, which is, you know, getting the psychotherapy, getting the dietitian who can support you with coming up with a meal plan that works for you, none of that gets covered. And that is a failure of our medical system, but that's just the case. And so if you have private insurance, that's amazing, but sometimes we run into situations where people are having to pay out of pocket for this. And that is a challenge that will continue to present itself. There are, you know, some clinics that do things under the public healthcare system. The way things are funded, BC tends to have much better coverage for obesity treatment, and so the clinics there tend to be free or covered by the provincial healthcare system. In Ontario, it's a little bit more challenging just because of how our funding model works. But there are some clinics that do have a certain degree of support that can be covered under OHIP. I think, yeah, that is an ongoing challenge. There is, I know, a lot of work being done to kind of work with the Ministry of Health and get obesity more recognized. It wasn't until 2015 that obesity was recognized as a medical condition, right? So that's not that long ago. And so prior to that, it was just thought of as like a lifestyle problem. And so we're getting there. We're not there yet, but we're improving, and that's good. We are getting better coverage from insurance companies for the anti-obesity medications as well. Even in the past year, I've seen better coverage coming from the insurance companies. So there are, you know, I know the pharmaceutical industry is working on getting better coverage with the insurance companies. I know physicians are advocating as well. So we are tackling it from different angles, and we're getting there. We're just not there yet.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone, you can ask a question live. If you're struggling to find the feature on Zoom, you can just unmute yourself and say, hey, I've got a question. Just worry that some people, I know sometimes I struggle to find the raise hand button, but while we're waiting for a live question, we'll go back to the chat box.
Okay, thank you. We are getting some more questions around the pillars that you described. Dr. High, one of the questions is around the medication pillar. Could you give an example or your perspective on how the pillars integrate in terms of, you know, when they're considered for patients and how the medication pillar in particular is considered?
Mm-hmm. So anti-obesity medication, is typically offered for people who have a BMI greater than 30. So that's what we classify as obesity, or greater than 27 plus an adiposity related comorbidity. Now, there's lots of inherent flaws with that, because we all know that BMI is a flawed diagnostic criteria. Like, we shouldn't even be using it, but we still are using it. It's messed up, but we need to do better there. But currently that's the official guidelines. There are 3 approved medications in Canada. Their names are Xenical, Contrave, and Saxenda. Xenical has been around for a long time. It causes you to not absorb fat in your stool, and so you poop it out. With that comes some nasty side effects. So typically that one is not in favor anymore. And so we really have the 2 options, which is Contrave and Saxenda. There are some off-label options. So there's medications that are approved for other medical conditions, but that we will use in treating obesity as well. But the Contrave and Saxenda are they're more, what I'll say, intelligent medications, in that they actually target the pathophysiology of disrupted energy regulation in the brain. So as I said earlier, obesity is a disease of neurobiology and your endocrine hormones. And so these medications actually tackle what's happening in the brain in a central control perspective, where there's a disruption in like the energy balance and your appetite control, to help regulate weight centrally. So, you know, I won't go into the specific mechanism of action of the 2 of them. They are slightly different, but it really is that the medications that are coming out now are based on the pathophysiology, understanding that this is, you know, neurochemistry, as opposed to our old mentality of like, well, if we can just get you to poop out calories, then you'll lose weight, right? Like, that's kind of what the old mentality was.
Thank you. Back to the chat box.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful, Dr. High. We have a question around food addiction. How does this relate to your topic today? What would be your feedback on someone asking about food addiction?
Is Tanya here? Does she want to answer this? I don't see her. I think her internet cut out. So I'll explain it like this. Overeating happens on a spectrum. There is passive overeating, which is I went to the movies and I had a bag of popcorn, even though I wasn't hungry because we were at the movies, and that's what you do. So it's like you're just kind of passively overeating. You're overeating because you don't really need that nutritional requirement. You're not actually hungry, you're just eating. Then there's compulsive overeating, which is overeating with, where you feel like this compulsion to do it. You might feel a little bit out of control. Next on the spectrum, there's like loss of control eating and night eating syndrome. There's some categories that fall under that. Then there's what we call binge eating disorder, which is a DSM-5 psychiatric diagnosis. And that's an impulse control issue, often associated with ADHD, of executive functioning. And then on the last part of the spectrum, where we would consider processed food addiction. So, we put that qualifier that it's a processed food addiction because, people who argue that food addiction is not a real thing say, well, when you have, alcohol addiction, you stop drinking alcohol altogether, and you can't do that with food because you can't stop eating. And so I think that's a flawed argument because yes, you can stop eating processed food if it is triggering an addictive behavior in your brain. So some people with obesity may have processed food addiction, but not everyone with obesity has a food addiction issue. Many of us have overeating, right? Like most human beings passively overeat from time to time, and then we find ourselves somewhere on that spectrum, and some people find themselves more on the end. Where it becomes addiction is our brain. There's a part of our brain called our limbic system, which is our reward brain, where food is supposed to generate pleasure. And that was important for our survival as a species because we have to go and get more food and eat more food in order to survive. So if it wasn't pleasurable and we stopped eating, we would all die. So our brain has evolved to have pleasure and reward attached to food that generates motivation to go and eat more. But the problem is with the processed foods and the food industry, and an entire industry that spends billions of dollars engineering foods to hijack that part of our brain so we're going to buy more and eat more, right? Because they're all about their bottom line, which is making money. And so they have designed foods that really trigger and light up that part of the brain. And there are some people with obesity where the studies have shown that their reward brain just lights up way more than someone who doesn't have obesity. And so, from the person's perspective, they are a bad person with no willpower. But what we actually understand is it's not about that at all. It's about your physiology. And if your brain is like lighting up because of these processed foods, it's going to drive a whole lot more desire than your neighbor who doesn't have that problem. So with addiction, it's that you have some, and then you need more, and then you need more, and then you need more because it kicks in that addictive cycle in your reward brain. And so for people with addiction, and Tanya kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier when she mentioned moderation doesn't work because if you have an addictive process, you can't moderate that. So an alcoholic, someone who has, I should reframe that wording, someone who has alcohol dependency cannot have one beer. And so for us to sit around and say like, you should just have the willpower to sit down and have one beer and judge them for that, that's exactly what we do with people who have processed food addiction when we tell them that they should be able to do moderation. That's just not how their brain works. Those trigger foods for them light up that addictive process. And so for them, the freedom comes when they abstain, right? When they enter into abstinence around those foods, that brings so much freedom because their brain chatter quiets down. And I know Sandra talks about this all the time, right? Like the brain chatter quiets down and they can live in a place where they, feel in control and feel free from like the constant like urges and desire and all of that, everything going on in the reward brain. So I hope that answers the question.
That's a great definition. And Tanya's back. I don't know if Tanya would like to add to that, please.
Yeah, no, Sasha just framed it up. I think she was thinking about me a couple of times when she was talking there. But exactly, I was able to identify that I have an addiction process, like to processed foods in particular. So my go-to foods were very much baked goods of any kind, and processed foods, even deli meats, pepperettes, anything processed, really. And so with those triggers and moderation, so that's why it was key for me with moderation, as I would see on a lot of social media, everything, you should be able to do everything in moderation. And I used to beat myself up about that when I would be all in on a diet and doing really well. And now I'm confronted of having that piece of birthday cake. I I would say I have to be able to manage one piece of cake. Tanya, you have to be able to get this done. People expect this. I should be able to do this with moderation. And I never could. I'd have the one and immediately I'm thinking, when am I getting the second piece of that other piece of cake? So as I was learning and growing through this, I was able to make those connections and go, wow, like that's why I wanted to do it, because I have underlying addiction tendencies. And then I look at my life and say, well, yeah, that makes sense because I used to smoke. So what's that? That's an addiction, right? If I look back at my family and the addictions that are within my family, I have addictions in my family. So they all get passed down. And I'm not blaming anybody for where I am today, but it's recognizing them so then I can work with them and use the tools that I've now learned to manage that moving forward. One of the triggers that I didn't even realize that I had or have happened this weekend. And it was food related, but not food related. It was in the grocery store. It was snowing on the weekend. There was Christmas music playing. I come around the edge where there's the deli meats and there's the baked goods. There's cookies all stacked high, all bigger and bigger because it's Christmas. And immediately this was over. I'm like, I need to be buying these things because that's what Christmas was to me, right? It was, I need to have those. And then I'm having a chatter in my brain thinking, but no, I don't need to have those. And what's happening? The lighting was low, the music was playing, it was hustle and bustle. It felt very Christmas. So here was an environmental trigger that I hadn't even prepared myself for. I have been working so much on what my food triggers are that here I was just plastered in front of my face, this environmental, and I felt uneasy. I felt out of control. And I had to take a break or not a break, but like a breath and think what was happening. And I'm like, wow, like I just listened to a podcast of Sasha's actually, she talks about environmental cues. I'm like, there's my environmental cue. Oh my goodness. So addiction is a real thing when it comes to food. It absolutely is, whoever is asking that question. And the biggest freedom I have had is identifying that and knowing that if I eat my particular trigger foods, it's going to cause a slippery slope or it's going to cause a lot of brain banter I don't want to deal with. It just is very uncomfortable. So yeah. I now make those choices where I use that restriction and restraint, all of it together to make me make better choices for myself.
I had a question for you, Dr. High. I often get pushback in the food addiction world when the abstinence model is presented because they feel that if you're over restrictive around certain foods, that it will always backfire. So that's the statement I get from many, many healthcare providers, that the abstinence model is not a good idea, it's not sustainable, and it will always backfire. How do you respond to that?
So ask someone like Tanya, who has tried moderation for 30 years and can't do it and felt like a failure because she couldn't do it and now has found freedom. So this is the problem. People who don't understand it look on the outside and they look at someone like Tanya not eating, let's use cake, okay? So she's not eating the slice of cake and they're like, you're so deprived. That's like restrictive. Look at how you have to restrict yourself. And so in their mind, they see it as restriction and deprivation, and how could you possibly live like that? And like, that's so punishing. And in her mind, she's like, you don't understand. I finally have freedom in my life. Like this has opened up my life to live this way, right? And so I think we need to, that's why I harp on mindset, right? It's all about understanding what is, like, if you're thinking of it as restriction, yeah, you're not going to be able to do that long term. But if you can see it as like, what am I gaining by doing this? Because my life has opened up and I've gained so much in my life when I stopped eating my trigger foods, because now I'm not obsessed about food and thinking about it from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep. Now I can live my life, right? Like it's a totally different experience. So back to empowerment. I was going to say something else and I lost my train of thought. I got so excited. But yeah, it's really the mindset that we go into it with.
Yes, I totally agree. There's lots of work to be done. Rosie, we have time for one more question from the chat box.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. We have a question that's related to the internal chatter food trigger discussions that we've been having today. And the question is, do you have any resources or book recommendations to help with reframing your thoughts around eating and dieting?
There are some good books. There's a book called DBT Skills for Emotional Eating, I believe it's what it's called. If you struggle kind of with binge behaviors, Chris Fairburn has a book. I'm a huge podcast fan, so I'm gonna share some podcasts that I think are good. There's a podcast called Losing 100 Pounds with Corinne, and she's a life coach who herself has lost 100 pounds, and she is very anti-diet mentality and comes from a place of learning to love yourself and then and reframe your thinking around food. I think that one's a nice one. She swears like a sailor, so just be aware. My podcast, the High on Life podcast. Other books that I think, I don't have other books off the top of my mind because I am such a podcast fan. Another really good podcast actually that I sometimes recommend to my patients is called Weight Loss for Busy Physicians by Katrina Ubell. She's another life coach from the States. Now it is geared, her clientele is women physicians who want to lose weight, but she teaches, it's all, you know, they call it coaching, but it's all psychotherapy. It's all kind of getting to the root, the mindset issues. So those would be really, really good starting places.
Yes, and if I could add to the list, I don't like the title of this book, but it really does tackle thinking traps. It's called The Diet Trap Solution, Train Your Brain to Lose Weight and Keep It Off for Good by Dr. Beck, Judith Beck. So it's a great book. The only piece of advice that I don't like in the book is it asks you to weigh yourself every single day, which I am fundamentally against. But otherwise, a really great book if people are interested in reading that. So that's it. This brings us to the end of today's session. I want to offer our sincere thanks to Sasha and Tanya for generously giving us your time today. My biggest takeaway and what I really appreciated Dr. High saying is begin with self-acceptance, total self-acceptance as you are today. Then, if you want to lose weight, look for research-based treatment options. Rachel, yours?
Oh, I love that. So mine is going to be really going back to that conversation we were having about kind of taking on a different language for the holidays so that I can approach the holidays with more of a joyous and less fearful thought around the food that I'm going to eat. And I probably should also be limiting the amount of Christmas holiday baking shows that I'm watching.
Yeah. I'm with you, Rachel. I never watch the Food Network. I never look at recipes on social media. I just don't want to be triggered. It's not worth it. So to get involved as a member of our Obesity Matters community, we will be sending out a survey and would appreciate you completing it so we can continue to build programs that are recommended by you, our community. Be sure to tune in for our next session on Wednesday, November 24th at noon Eastern Time. And the topic will be What's Best for Me? Exploring evidence-based obesity treatments. Wear your favorite holiday sweater color, and we'll see what the winning color is next week. So thank you again. See you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.